This video is sponsored by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. Sony smartphones are weird, in a good way. Honestly, that's why I look forward to a new one every summer. With the exception of foldables, no other phone pushes the envelope quite like a Sony Xperia. No one else is cramming a screen this sharp and a variable telephoto camera into a water-resistant chassis tall enough to stand out in a crowd. No one else has a camera division with a pedigree quite like Sony's, and no one else is going as far to blur the line between professional and phone photography. To test a phone like that, you need to give it a setting worthy of its stated skills. So I took it to one of my favorite places in the US to see how it tackled the monuments and the mysteries of Montauk. I'm Michael Fisher, and this is the Xperia 1iii Road Trip Review. Before we take the 120-mile journey to the very eastern end of New York State for our camera test, let's talk on the phone. Like the Mark II that came before it, the 1iii is a tall glass of water, but as I said in my Galaxy Fold 2 review, I really think this slender form factor is underrated. Our whole world is dominated by feeds, and a tall display lets you fit more on the screen while you scroll them, which is also easier to do if you've only got one hand free. If you need to run a couple apps side by side, you get more space to do so. Games have a little more breathing room as well. And if you just want to have a phone call, well, it's more comfortable for that too. Sony is leaning hard on the display to make the 1iii stand out, which is easy because it's one of the sharpest screens you can get on a phone. Like last year, it's a 6.5-inch HDR OLED with as many pixels across the long side as a 4K TV. But this year, it's gotten its refresh rate boosted to 120 Hz, which makes the Android 11 software with its minimal Sony overlay feel even faster than it already did. But honestly, I've never been here for the extravagant spec bumps, and a near 4K display on a smartphone is, and will always be, in my opinion, crazy overkill. It doesn't matter how sharp a screen is if it's hard to see outdoors. Yet again, this display just doesn't get bright enough, and that's a big miss. So while I do genuinely love watching video on this phone, I love it for different reasons. The lack of a notch or hole punch to interrupt the screen, and the dual front-facing speakers, which are almost half again as loud as last year's, so you don't have to do that stupid thing where you cup your hand around a side-firing speaker. Yeah, it's great not to have to do that. Speaking of the sides, they're studded with the convenient keys I still miss on pretty much every other phone. The textured camera shutter button is easy to find by feel. It lets you half-press it to focus, and you can set it to launch into either photography or cinema cameras with a long press. Between that and the volume rocker sits the fingerprint sensor and power button, which can also be programmed to launch a different camera app if you double-click it. And beneath that is a dedicated Google Assistant button. Using this phone reminded me of when I still reviewed cars. I used to say, touchscreens are great, but they're not always the right choice. The more controls I can find by feel, the better experience I tend to have. With the 1iii, I can use that shutter button to launch the camera as I pull it from my pocket, so that by the time it gets into position, it's ready to take the shot. The rest of the phone is a mix of expected upgrades and some old favorites many manufacturers have phased out. In the latter group, an RGB notification light and 3.5mm headphone jack, emphasis on headphone, stay tuned. The Gorilla Glass 6 on the back is now frosted to better battle fingerprints, thank you, while the front got a promotion to Gorilla Glass Victus, which scratched but didn't shatter after a pretty brutal sidewalk drop by yours truly. Also added reverse wireless charging to complement the existing Qi functionality, and there's now a 30-watt wired charger included in the box. A great fast charging complement to Sony's optional slow charging feature. That better preserves battery longevity, and I'm glad that Sony is continuing to include it. If it sounds like a lot to love, it really is. But when it comes to the camera experience, this phone often favors complexity over quality. Camera tests, battery life, and call quality, right after this.
I picked up a little head cold earlier this week. Nothing serious. I'm already mostly recovered. And part of that recovery is actually thanks to today's sponsor.
There's nothing like a home-cooked meal when you're under the weather.
I'm getting misty-eyed.
And HelloFresh gives me everything I need to make 3 meals for up to 4 people delivered in one recyclable box each week. I've told you before how it saves me time at the grocery store, about 40 minutes a week. And I've told you how it saves money, around $11 per meal split across my household. But mostly, I love how HelloFresh has taught me how to be comfortable in the kitchen. By giving me instructions I can't mess up,
Divide mixture in half. Divide mixture now, I can do that.
perfectly portioned ingredients to reduce waste, and 5-star meals
This is a good burger.
that are consistently delicious.
I've made prettier dishes, but I've never made one I needed so badly, nor was so delicious.
Remember, I'm not just a HelloFresh spokesman, I'm also a customer. So do what I did. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrMobile14 to get 14 free meals, plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrMobile14 to get 14 free meals, plus free shipping. Thanks to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Okay, cameras. The One Mark III basically inherits its primary and ultra-wide 12-megapixel cameras from its predecessor. So the big change sits behind this window at the bottom of the array. Sony has finally joined the likes of Huawei and Samsung by adding a periscope-style telephoto camera. But while other phones use a feature like this to add more zoom, Sony decided to use a variable telephoto lens here. And what that means is that the optical elements inside the phone physically move between a 70mm and a 105mm equivalent. That essentially gives you 2 zoom cameras in one. That cuts down on the number of cameras Sony had to put in, and as my friends David Amell and David Kogan pointed out to me, it offers an exciting look into a possible future where maybe we only need to have 1 or 2 variable cameras on our phones instead of 4 or 5 fixed ones. On the software side, there are improvements too. Sony has integrated the stock Android camera app into its Photography Pro hub. And that means when you hold down the shutter button, Photography Pro opens, but it opens in a tab called Basic, which is easy to use and will be familiar to most people. When you want to get more ambitious, you just swipe through to the various professional modes to get more and more granular control. I found this handy when automatic mode would want to add a little too much exposure to a scene. By hopping into manual and tweaking shutter speed and ISO, I could get the look I was after without relying on the processing to do it. And even in basic mode, yes, you do get last year's standout feature, that incredible burst mode at up to 20 frames per second, with continuous autofocus that's able to keep the subject locked, even if it has to lock onto an eyeball, and even if that eyeball isn't human. Seagulls eating parking lot pepperoni, old-timers bumming on the beach, Top Gun-type volleyball serves. I could play with burst mode all day. But photo samples aren't worth much without some competitive context. For this review, I shot alongside a Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra, and the differences, as always, are apparent. Despite toning it down in recent generations, Samsung still leans toward punchy photos in its processing. That means more saturation, more contrast, and usually more sharpness than Sony's photos, which tend to be more neutral, truer to life. Samsung's tuning also prioritizes dynamic range, which means it's able to pull more detail from the shadows, and often I appreciate that. But sometimes it comes at the expense of the kind of contrast or drama I'm going for. Now remember, photography is a subjective art form, so in good lighting and close range, the differences between these phones boil down to personal preference. It's when you get further out that things start looking worse for Sony. That variable telephoto may be groundbreaking, but it also takes up more space, so the One Mark III can realize a maximum of 4.4x optical zoom, compared to the Samsung's dedicated 3x and 10x telephoto cameras. The result? In almost every zoom shot I took, I preferred the Samsung output. The Galaxy S21 Ultra's auto mode is better able to cope with extreme contrast, and because of its higher magnification lenses, it's more likely to produce a photo I want to keep or share. Also, just out of curiosity, I tried some burst mode shooting on the Samsung to see if Sony's performance really outshined it as much as the hype suggests, and the Samsung held up better than I expected. After sundown, neither of these phones impressed me in terms of image quality. Each has its own issues. But at least the Samsung could usually keep focus. On the Xperia, that wonderful mid-morning photo you were able to get out of your breakfast sandwich with the perfectly accurate color and the nice creamy bokeh, after dinner time devolves into a muddy, motion-blurred mess that nothing short of a tripod can help with. In our current once-in-a-lifetime summer, when barroom photos and midnight selfies are about to be at an all-time high, this is a deeply frustrating camera to use. And don't come at me telling me, well, professional photographers don't party. They don't need to take selfies. Stop it. Even photographers need to cut loose, all right? Speaking of frustration, let's talk about video. Initially, I'd intended to shoot the entire road trip portion of this review in Sony's Cinema Pro app. But while this looks like a control panel for a professional camera, remember, it's connected to a phone camera. So it's like the worst of both worlds. You're getting all the complexity with none of the performance. Everything takes 5 times as long to shoot, and unless you're in a studio controlling the environment, the end result is seldom worth the added time. David Kogan explained part of the reason why.
What did we try first? 90, and now we're down to 45, 140 or 45. These are degrees.
Yeah.
And it's still f***ing overexposed because
the aperture is fixed, and so all you have is the frame rate and the ISO and the...
The takeaway is that I shot the majority of the road trip review in the basic video mode, only switching to Cinema Pro when I wanted to tell the spooky Montauk project part of the story. Let's take a look.
be a great situation for tap to focus, if it worked. Oh yeah, oh, a powerful reveal.
Your contention that maybe there is such a thing as too much garlic?
Perhaps deserves a review.
When you do the driving,
you're like, whoa.
woo!
I'm standing between two of the most significant and yet wildly divergent landmarks in New York State. The first, and unquestionably the most famous, is right over my shoulder, the Montauk Lighthouse, commissioned by George Washington, completed in 1797 and marker of the very easternmost point in New York State. Next stop, France. And the second is this AN FPS 35 search radar right behind me, here at the decommissioned Montauk Air Force Station. This is one of only 12 ever built from the 1960s, and it's the only one left standing. This was part of a system called SAGE, or Semi-Automated Ground Environment, that was meant to protect the US from Soviet bombers during the Cold War. But if you grew up here as a teenager, you may have heard a slightly different story. That story? That this Air Force Station never actually closed when that mission became obsolete, instead continuing to operate for years as a clandestine installation under the control of shadowy government forces who exploited the old radar technology for radio frequency-based mind control experiments. Combined with tales of underground facilities, odd behaviors in Montauk Village, and the fact that the station remained closed to the public for years despite officially being classified as state park, it all added up to a conspiracy theory juicy enough to prompt me and literally hundreds of other teenagers who grew up on eastern Long Island to repeatedly break into the base to try to unlock its secrets. It was only after the application of some critical thinking and the bare minimum of research that I discovered that the underground facilities were in fact leftover World War II coastal defense emplacements. The park's delayed opening to the public, the result of environmental factors and bureaucratic red tape, the so-called odd behavior in Montauk, either fabricated or simply a side effect of a small town where not much happens in the winter. But the mystery was one of many things I treasured about this town when I would drive out here as a teen in search of adventure, and decades later, the Duffer Brothers would leverage that mystery to transform the lore into a Netflix phenomenon called
Stranger Things. If you're wondering about that poor audio quality, yeah, join the club. I had to tweak it just to make sure you could hear me over that tree noise. At first I thought it might be a byproduct of the intelligent wind filter, but turning it off didn't seem to make much difference. Now, I'd anticipated problems like these, so I'd planned on using my Rode Wireless Go microphones for those stand-ups, but the headphone jack on this phone doesn't support analog audio for that purpose. In other bizarre oversights for a camera-centric phone, you can't tap to focus when rolling video in the basic mode, you can't switch which camera you're using in the middle of a video shot, and the interface doesn't invert when you turn the phone upside down.
Now look, you can say that this thing is so specialized that Sony only expects to sell like 5,000 of them. You can make that argument. But it seems to me that it's possible to build a smartphone that includes all of those specialty features without sacrificing all the basics that people have come to expect from their flagship smartphone cameras. You know, things like reliable autofocus and good to great night mode and that kind of fire and forget reliability that's like, I don't have time to get everything tweaked just right. I'm just gonna spray and pray, fire and forget, and hey, what do you know, it came out. And it's not like Sony isn't capable of building the hardware to do that. I mean, it powers the optics in most flagship smartphones. It just seems to be unwilling or unable to do the work when it comes to its own house-branded smartphones. And that's weird.
To finish up with the basics, I didn't have as bad a time with this battery as most other reviewers seemed to, but there's no question it's not the longest lasting phone in history. It would probably last a bit longer if it didn't have to drive a high-res display at near max brightness every time you went outside. If you work in an office, you'll almost certainly make it to bedtime, but if you're making extensive use of the cameras, as I did, you'll definitely need to top up before dinner. And finally, phone calls are a similar mixed bag. Callers sounded excellent, but wind rejection on my side was pretty terrible. I frequently had to repeat myself or just find a corner out of the weather to be understood. And as an added annoyance, my thumb kept accidentally unlocking the phone while I talked on it, which led to a lot of fumble fingers by my cheek meat. Nothing about the Xperia 1 Mark III should come as a surprise if you've followed Sony Mobile over the past couple years. The company has leaned further away from the mainstream, further toward specialty boutique products. If Xperia phones were jewelry, they'd be tool watches. So it follows that the price is on the high side at about $1,300, which includes a set of noise-canceling earbuds and a metric ton of Call of Duty CP points if you order by September 26th. To me, that price isn't the problem. And this is one of the most powerful smartphones you can buy, with excellent design to boot. But its value is inextricably intertwined with its camera. A camera so dependent on being in professional hands to shine that, well, it's just tough to recommend to anyone except the type of professional photographers who'd be better off shooting with the mirrorless cameras they've probably already got in their bag anyway. This review was produced following 2 weeks with the Sony Xperia 1 Mark III review sample provided by Sony, but as always, the company didn't have any editorial input into this video, nor did it provide compensation for or receive an early preview of same. They're seeing it right alongside you for the first time. For more from Montauk, be sure to check out David Kogan's real-world test featuring the Samsung Galaxy Book Go. That's the video he was shooting while we were out there, and I think he ended up having even more fun than I did.
I will take that as a win, coming from Fisher.
Please subscribe to the MrMobile on YouTube if you'd like to see more videos like this. Until next time, I'm Michael Fisher. Thanks for watching, and stay mobile, my friends.